It was supposed to be a calm Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the sun peeked over the rooftops just enough to paint everything golden, and the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet except for the chirping of birds. Emily, my wife, had gone outside to do what she loved most, gardening. She was kneeling by the front hedge, trimming the edges with her small shears, humming a tune under her breath, completely unaware that within moments her peaceful morning was about to be shattered. The quiet was broken by the low rumble of an SUV engine rolling slowly into our driveway. The sound immediately caught her attention because it wasn't one of the neighbors. Everyone in our community had familiar cars, and this one was new, sleek, and tinted all around, the kind of vehicle that screamed trouble more than anything official. The SUV came to a stop, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in dark navy shirts with patches on their sleeves and shiny badges clipped to their chests, but something about them didn't sit right. Their uniforms didn't look like any real police department, and their body language gave off arrogance instead of professionalism. One had a clipboard in hand, the other wore a pair of aviator sunglasses even though the morning sun wasn't that bright. Emily stood up, brushing dirt off her gloves, trying to keep calm but instantly alert. She greeted them politely, "Can I help you?" The taller man didn't even say hello. He barked out, "Ma'am, we're here from the HOA Security Division. You're in violation of community codes." Emily blinked, confused. She had been part of the neighborhood for years, knew the HOA rules inside and out, and she knew there was no such thing as an HOA Security Division. Still, she kept her composure and asked, "Violation? What violation are you talking about?" The man with the clipboard smirked as if he had rehearsed his lines. "We've received reports about your yard maintenance. You've let weeds grow out of control. On top of that, there have been multiple noise complaints. You're looking at some serious fines if this continues." Emily almost laughed in disbelief. Our yard was the cleanest on the street, she prided herself on it. As for noise, the loudest thing to ever come from our home was the sound of the blender when she made her morning smoothies. She narrowed her eyes and replied firmly, "That's not true. If there's a real issue, I'll be contacting the HOA president directly to clear this up." At that, the taller man took a step forward, his tone growing harsher. "Don't get smart with us, lady. We've got the authority here. You think you can just ignore HOA enforcement? It doesn't work that way. Pay up, or you'll regret it." Emily stiffened. She wasn't easily intimidated, but the way he stepped closer made her uneasy. She tried to stay calm. "I don't think you have the authority you're claiming. And I won't be bullied in my own yard." The man with the sunglasses suddenly hissed, "You'd better watch your mouth. We can escalate this, and it won't be pretty." Emily took a breath, deciding she'd had enough of this ridiculous act. She reached into her apron pocket for her phone. "I'll be calling my husband," she began, but before she could finish, the man with the clipboard stepped in front of her, his eyes cold with malice. In one swift, shocking movement, he raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound cracked through the quiet morning like a gunshot. Emily gasped, stumbling back a step, her hand flying up to her cheek. The pain stung, but the shock was worse. She stared at him wide-eyed, unable to believe a supposed HOA officer had just put his hands on her. The taller man sneered, as if he enjoyed the look of fear he thought he saw in her eyes. "Now you'll listen," he said, his voice dripping with false authority. Emily wasn't a weak woman, she was tough in her own right, but at that moment, fear coursed through her because she was alone in the yard with two aggressive strangers who clearly weren't who they claimed to be. She swallowed hard, standing her ground despite the fear. "You'll regret that," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. What those men didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have prepared for, was who her husband was. Inside the house, not 20 feet away, I was sitting in my study upstairs, sipping coffee and going through emails. I had the window cracked open to let in the fresh air, and that's when I heard it. First, the raised voices, the unfamiliar tone of strangers talking to Emily in a way no one should. Then, the sound that made my heart stop, the sharp slap followed by Emily's gasp. In that split second, my pulse surged, my grip on the coffee mug tightened, and my entire body shifted from calm husband to trained warrior. Years of Navy SEAL training didn't just vanish when I left the service. It lived inside me, dormant but ready, and the moment I heard my wife being struck, it roared to life with a vengeance. My chair flew back as I shot to my feet, muscles tense, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate, I moved. Every step down the stairs was fast, heavy, and purposeful, echoing through the house like thunder. By the time I reached the front door, I was already locked into a mindset those men could never have imagined. My vision narrowed, my senses sharpened, and the only thought in my mind was protecting Emily at all costs. As I threw open the door, I saw her standing there, her face red and marked where she'd been slapped, her hand clutching her cheek, her body trembling but her spirit unbroken. And across from her stood the two men, smug and arrogant, smirking like predators who thought they had cornered their prey. They had no idea the hunter had just stepped into their trap. But the trap wasn't for Emily. The trap was for them. Inside the house, as I stood frozen for a half second after hearing that slap, something inside me snapped in a way I hadn't felt in years. The sound of my wife's cry wasn't just noise, it was an alarm, a siren blaring in my chest, pulling me straight back to the battlefield mindset I thought I'd left behind when I came home from the Navy. My body reacted before my brain even processed it, muscle memory firing like lightning. The mug of coffee slipped from my hand and shattered against the hardwood floor, but I didn't care. All I could think about was Emily. Every step I took down the stairs thundered like a war drum, and my heart was pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. When I reached the door and flung it open, I saw the scene unfold in front of me, and the image is burned into my mind forever. Emily, my strong, beautiful wife, stood there with tears glistening in her eyes, one hand pressed against her cheek where red finger marks stood out against her pale skin. She looked shocked but not broken, and behind her stood two men who thought they were predators. The smugness on their faces ignited something primal in me. I wasn't looking at petty bullies anymore, I was looking at threats. And threats get neutralized. "Step away from my wife," I growled, my voice deeper and darker than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't just words, it was a warning, a promise of what would come if they didn't listen. The taller one turned toward me, puffing his chest like he thought he could intimidate me. He sneered, "Sir, this doesn't concern you. We're handling an HOA violation. Stay back before this gets ugly." Ugly? It was already ugly, and not for me. I stared straight into his eyes, every inch of me radiating the kind of control and power that years of special operations training had burned into my soul. Violation? You assaulted my wife. You've got 5 seconds to tell me who you really are before I end this. My words hung in the air like heavy chains, and for the first time, their false confidence cracked. They exchanged a glance, like two kids caught in a lie, but then the shorter one scoffed and tried to recover his bravado. "We're with HOA enforcement. We can do what we need. Don't make this harder on yourself." That was it, the confirmation I needed. No real cop, no real official, would say something so sloppy and arrogant. These men weren't officers, they were imposters, fakes trying to play dress-up and scare homeowners. But the moment they touched Emily, this stopped being some scam. It became personal, and they had just stumbled into the worst mistake of their lives. The air seemed to thicken as I stepped closer, squaring my shoulders, my entire body tense and coiled like a spring. The taller man tried to step toward me, maybe thinking his size would give him the edge, but I had seen bigger, scarier men in war zones. I had faced enemies armed to the teeth, trained fighters who knew what they were doing, and I had come out alive. Compared to them, these two clowns in fake uniforms were nothing. Still, arrogance can make people dangerous, and I wasn't about to underestimate them, not with Emily standing a few feet away. My training told me to control the situation, keep my opponent off balance, and never let emotion cloud my moves. But seeing Emily's cheek red and swollen from that slap made staying calm almost impossible. My fists clenched, my teeth ground together, and for the first time since I left active duty, I felt that old surge of battle rage flood through me. The taller man lifted his hand slightly, like he was reaching for something in his pocket. My instinct screamed weapon, and in that moment, my mind flashed through possibilities: a knife, maybe a taser, maybe even a gun. I didn't wait to find out. I shifted my weight forward, ready to strike if he pulled anything. My stance widened, my breathing slowed, and every sense sharpened like a blade. The shorter one took a step to the side, like he was trying to flank me, but I pivoted to keep them both in front of me, my eyes locked on their movements, not their words. They were amateurs, but amateurs with bad intentions can still be deadly. I wasn't going to give them the chance. Emily stood frozen behind me, her breath shaky, her voice barely above a whisper as she said my name. I tilted my head slightly, enough to reassure her without taking my eyes off the threat. "It's okay, Emily. They're done." But the truth was, they didn't even realize they were done yet. They still thought they had control. They still thought 2 men against 1 husband meant power. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know, was that they weren't facing just a husband. They were facing a man who had spent over a decade in the Navy SEALs, a man who had been trained to handle chaos, to dismantle threats with precision, to end fights before they even began. They were facing someone who had been forged in the fires of combat, someone who had lived in the shadows and survived because hesitation was never an option. I took a step closer, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You picked the wrong house. You touched the wrong woman. And now, you're about to find out exactly how big a mistake you made." The taller one tried to bluff again, straightening his shoulders, his fake badge glinting in the sunlight. "You don't scare us, old man," he spat. Old man. The words almost made me laugh. If only he knew what kind of man he was actually talking to. I didn't bother responding with words this time. Instead, I let my silence speak, my stance speak, the way my eyes locked on his like a predator studying prey. Because in my mind, the fight had already started, and I knew exactly how it was going to end. Emily stood behind me, clutching her phone now, ready to call for help if I needed it. But I didn't. These men thought they were in control, but the truth was, the second they laid a hand on Emily, they had already lost. The moment the taller man tried to close the gap between us, squaring up like he actually believed his size would intimidate me, I knew the fight was seconds away from starting. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tensed, and his hand twitched near his pocket like he was about to pull something out. I didn't wait for him to act, because hesitation in situations like this can cost you everything. My body moved faster than his brain could process, years of training taking over in a flash. I stepped into his space, grabbed his wrist, and twisted it sharply behind his back, using his own momentum against him. The shock on his face was priceless, but it only lasted a second before his cheek slammed against the hood of his own SUV with a loud metallic thud. He grunted, trying to fight against my grip, but I tightened the hold until I heard the pained groan rip out of his throat. The fake badge pinned to his shirt slipped loose and clattered to the ground, proof of the lie he was hiding behind. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but I didn't let myself get distracted. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shorter one panic, his expression shifting from arrogance to pure fear, but instead of backing down, he lunged at me like a cornered animal. Amateurs always make the mistake of thinking speed and aggression will give them the edge, but against a trained fighter, it just gets them taken apart faster. As he charged, I released the taller man just enough to pivot, sidestepped the incoming tackle, and used my leg to sweep his feet out from under him. He went down hard, hitting the grass with a grunt as his sunglasses flew off and landed crooked on the driveway. For a moment, the only sounds were their groans and Emily's uneven breathing behind me. I stood tall between her and them, my stance wide, my fists clenched, my eyes burning into the two of them. "You hit my wife," I said, my voice low but filled with fury. "Now you answer to me." The shorter one scrambled to his knees, his face twisted with rage and desperation, and I saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. A taser. He'd pulled it from his belt, his thumb fumbling to activate it as the sparks crackled faintly in the morning air. My instinct screamed, and before he could even raise it, I moved. I closed the distance in 2 steps, striking his wrist with the edge of my hand. The taser flew out of his grasp and skidded across the driveway into the bushes. He barely had time to process before my elbow connected solidly with his chest, the impact driving the air out of his lungs in a wheezing gasp. He collapsed onto his back, clutching his ribs and struggling to breathe, his fake authority draining from him with every painful breath. The taller man, dazed from being slammed against the SUV, staggered to his feet, one hand rubbing his jaw where it had hit the metal. His arrogance was gone, replaced by wide-eyed panic. His chest heaved as he looked at me like he was finally realizing he wasn't dealing with some ordinary suburban husband. You don't know who you're messing with," he stammered, his voice shaking. I stepped toward him slowly, controlled, every movement deliberate. My eyes locked on his like a predator locking on prey. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with," I replied coldly. "2 frauds who thought they could intimidate a woman alone. But you picked the wrong house. And the wrong husband." He tried to bluster, his lips parting to spit some excuse or threat, but his words faltered when I closed the space between us and shoved him back against the SUV again. This time I didn't slam him, I just leaned in close enough for him to see the unshakable calm in my eyes, the calm of a man who had seen war and survived it. "You don't scare me," he whispered, but even he didn't believe it. His voice cracked, his shoulders trembled, and I could feel the fear radiating off him. I leaned closer, my voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through his false bravado. "Good. You should be scared. Because the moment you touched my wife, you crossed a line you can't uncross." Behind me, the shorter man was still on the ground, coughing and trying to push himself up, but every time he moved, pain rippled across his face. Emily stood just a few feet away, her eyes wide, watching me dismantle these so-called enforcers with a mix of shock and relief. She had seen me angry before, sure, but she had never seen this side of me, the side I had tried to leave behind when I left the Navy. And truthfully, I hadn't wanted her to. But now, she saw it all. The controlled fury, the precision, the cold efficiency. The side of me that came out only when there was no other option. The taller man tried one last desperate move, swinging a wild punch at me, but it was sloppy, slow, and telegraphed a mile away. I ducked under it easily, grabbed his arm, and twisted him around, forcing him down to his knees with a joint lock that made him scream in pain. His hand slapped the ground as he begged me to let go. "Please, please, man, stop," he cried, his voice cracking with terror. I tightened the hold just enough to remind him who was in control. "You think it's fun to scare women? You think you can just slap someone's wife and walk away?" My voice was steady, but inside, I was a storm barely held in check. The shorter man groaned from the grass, finally managing to crawl to his knees, clutching his chest. His face was pale, his eyes darting between me and his partner like he was trying to figure out whether to run or fight again. But he didn't move, not with Emily standing behind me holding her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. "You're not going anywhere," I said, my eyes flicking between the two of them. "You're going to sit there, and you're going to wait, because this isn't over until the real cops get here." For the first time since they'd arrived, both men looked truly broken. Their arrogance had drained completely, replaced with the sickening realization that their scam, their false authority, their intimidation, all of it had crumbled in the face of someone they couldn't bully. Their fake uniforms looked ridiculous now, their badges nothing more than cheap pieces of metal. They weren't predators anymore. They were just cowards, exposed and beaten, waiting for the consequences they thought they could outrun. I kept my grip on the taller man's arm, pressing him against the SUV just hard enough to remind him he wasn't going anywhere, while the shorter one wheezed on the grass like a fish out of water, clutching his chest and trying to catch his breath. My pulse was still pounding in my ears, the adrenaline flooding every vein in my body, but I forced myself to stay focused. In moments like this, it would have been easy to let rage take over completely, but years of training had taught me that control is what separates survival from chaos. Emily, still shaken, clutched her phone tightly, and I gave her a quick nod. "Call 911, I said, my voice steady, though I could hear the storm underneath it. She dialed immediately, her voice trembling as she told the dispatcher our address and explained what had happened. When she said the words, they slapped me. My grip unconsciously tightened on the man I was holding, making him yelp in pain, but I didn't care. He deserved far worse than what I was giving him. "The police are on their way," Emily said, her eyes locking with mine, her face still red from the slap but filled with a mixture of anger and relief. I turned my attention back to the men. "You hear that? Real cops are coming. You're not leaving. Sit down. Now." I shoved the taller one down onto the pavement, and he crumpled to his knees, his hands raised slightly like he finally understood resistance was pointless. The shorter one, realizing there was no escape, sat back down on the grass, his chest heaving. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to step back, standing between Emily and them like a wall. The minutes that followed felt long, but I didn't take my eyes off the two men. They muttered weak excuses under their breath, mumbling about misunderstandings and just doing their job, but I didn't let them get away with it. "Your job?" I snapped. "Your job is scamming innocent people. Your job is putting your hands on women and thinking no one will stop you. Well, congratulations, you just picked the one house you should have avoided." My words silenced them. They lowered their heads, their bravado completely stripped away, leaving only the pathetic reality of who they were. Emily stepped closer to me, her hand slipping into mine, and though she was still trembling, there was steel in her eyes now. She had always been strong, but seeing these men broken in front of her gave her a sense of justice that words couldn't describe. We didn't have to wait long before the sound of sirens pierced the morning air, growing louder with every second. Red and blue lights flashed across the street as two squad cars rolled up, the real law enforcement finally arriving. Neighbors began to peek out their doors and windows, whispers carrying down the street as they tried to piece together what was happening. I stayed still, keeping the men in sight until the officers approached. The first officer stepped out, his hand on his holster, scanning the scene quickly. "What's going on here?" he asked firmly. I raised my hand slightly, palms open, showing I was calm and cooperative. "These two men," I said, pointing at them, showed up pretending to be HOA security. "They tried to intimidate my wife, then one of them slapped her. I restrained them until you got here." Emily nodded vigorously, stepping forward to confirm. "They hit me. He slapped me across the face," she said, her voice shaking but strong. The officer's expression hardened immediately as he turned to the two fakes. "On the ground. Now," he barked. The taller man tried to stammer out an excuse, but before he could finish, the officers had them on their stomachs, cuffing their hands behind their backs. Watching them get restrained, their fake authority stripped completely, felt like the final nail in the coffin. As the officers frisked them, they pulled out counterfeit IDs, cheap metal badges, and even a stack of phony violation tickets they had clearly been using to scam families in neighborhoods just like ours. Emily gasped when she saw the stack of fake tickets, realizing just how many innocent people they had probably conned. The officers glanced at me, one of them nodding slightly in respect. "Sir, judging by the state of these guys, you really did a number on them," he said. I shrugged, my voice even. "I only gave them what they earned." The officers didn't argue, they could see the bruises starting to form, the fear written all over the impostors' faces. One of the men finally broke, his voice shaking as he blurted, "We were just trying to make some money." "We didn't mean," the officer cut him off immediately. "Save it. You're going to jail for impersonating law enforcement, assault, and fraud." Hearing those words made Emily let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping as some of the tension left her body. She leaned into me, her head against my shoulder, and for the first time since this all began, I let myself relax just a little. As the squad cars pulled away with the frauds in the back, the neighborhood grew quiet again, except for the murmurs of neighbors watching from their porches. Some looked shocked, others impressed, and a few even nodded at me with silent respect. Emily squeezed my hand tightly, her voice soft but firm. "Remind me never to doubt your Navy SEAL training again." I smiled faintly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You don't have to remind me," I whispered. "No one, fake cop, HOA bully, or anyone else, will ever hurt you while I'm here." She smiled back, tears finally streaming down her face, but they weren't just from fear anymore, they were from relief. Relief that it was over, relief that justice had been served, and relief that the man standing beside her would always be her shield. That night, as we sat together on the couch, Emily rested her head on my chest, and I could feel her heartbeat finally steadying. We talked about what had happened, and though she was still shaken, she kept saying the same words over and over, "I feel safe with you." And that was all I needed to hear. Because at the end of the day, that was my mission. Not the missions overseas, not the battles I had fought in faraway lands, but this one. Protecting her. Protecting us. And I knew one thing for certain, those two men had learned the hardest lesson of their lives. They thought they could intimidate, threaten, and even strike a woman without consequence. But they discovered, painfully and completely, that when you mess with the wrong family, when you lay hands on the wrong wife, you answer to the husband who just happens to be a Navy SEAL. And for them, that lesson came with broken pride, broken plans, and bruises they would never forget.